Hello and welcome to another episode of Smart Talk. Today we're going to discuss the Middle East and Israel's war of aggression against Iran. With me to break down the situation and most importantly, lay out how Marxists should approach this is Perrault. Hello.
Hello.
So 4 days ago, Israel attacked Iran and Iran has retaliated. This is a massive escalation in the Middle East. US and Britain stand at the ready to back Israel militarily. And in my opinion, it's not so easy to predict what's going to happen. But I think for us right now, the question that I want to focus on today is what to do. As revolutionaries in the West, but in general, what ought we be fighting for amongst the working class and in the left? What to do? That's the main question I want to focus on. But I think before we can even get there, we need to understand what's actually at stake in this war. Or in other words, in the Marxist lingo, what is the character of this war? So if we can just start with that.
Yeah, that's really has to be the key starting point to understand an orientation in this war. But basically, it's quite simple. Israel has been now for like we're getting close to 2 years committing a genocide in Palestine. And this is really just a normal continuation of the Zionist project of national oppression of the Palestinians. But since the beginning of the Zionist project, Israel can never tolerate any rival in the region that could threaten its ambitions in the region. And so for Israel, Iran is a total obstacle because it actually represents a real regional counterweight. And so the goal of this war is really an extension of the war in Gaza, and it's really to destroy any kind of counterweight in the region. Israel basically would like to throw back the regional strength of Iran, destroy its ability to launch missiles, destroy its nuclear program, and I think really turn back the wheel of the entire social development of that society.
Some could ask, well, why has it taken this long? There's obviously the timing was interesting. Iran was in the midst of nuclear negotiations with the US, and then this just happened. As a general statement, it's correct that Israel cannot tolerate a proper counterweight and has always seen Iran as a threat. But do you think timing matters, or how do we approach that?
Listen, I can't pretend to understand or know what all the dealings in the back rooms were around all of this. And I think the key is to understand the dynamic that was started with October 7. Israel has been pushed to be more and more aggressive and expand more and more its offensive. And that this is in the context where the United States is really trying to reassert its global position. And Israel is really playing the spearhead for the United States in this region, and knocking out Iran would be a key objective for the United States. So, of course, they want to do this as well, the United States, and they're fully behind Israel. Now, their ability to do this is a question, and I think that's probably the timing had to do probably with negotiations between the US and Israel, and of course, military preparations to execute this.
Okay, so I guess as far as it concerns how to understand what's happening, your basic claim is that Palestine's at the heart of this, and this is an extension of the conflict.
It's basically a war of national aggression on the part of Israel against Iran. And that's part of the broader conflict, an extension of the conflict that defines Israel itself, which is the oppression of the Palestinian people.
Okay. We'll come back to this, obviously, but part of why I was pushing you to spell that out as simply as possible is because surveying the left just even a little bit, there's a tendency to become super formalistic. Well, no, Iran's also a capitalist country and they're also led by a reactionary regime. So Iran and Israel, they're just going at it or something like that. So that's why I wanted you to spell that out. Okay, so what's a Marxist position?
Well, for Marxists, it matters really if it's a war of national aggression and a defensive war on the part of Iran, then Marxists take a stand in defense of Iran and also in defense of Palestine, which is basically the same argument, the same logic. So for us, it's very clear. You can be neutral in this conflict. If Israel gets its way and is able to crush the Iranian nations, there's many different nations in Iran, and destroy the economy, destroy the military infrastructure, it's just going to give imperialism free rein in the whole region to increase its devastation, really brutally oppress the Palestinians even more. Mm-hmm. And it would be really a disaster. So we can't just say, war is bad in this case. Marxists have to take a side, and workers internationally have to take a side.
Yeah. We put out a leaflet the day that this broke out, and we say it's just very simple. Workers stand with Iran and Palestine.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, if Iran is weakened, the US will obviously have much more free reign in the Middle East, but this will have international implications in terms of the conditions of the working class, West and in the global South. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on this?
So yeah, for us, it's not actually fundamentally a moral argument. It's really in the interest of workers all around the world to oppose this war of aggression on the part of Israel. Mm-hmm. And so for the workers in the West, if the imperialists get away with it, get away with this war, they will suck in workers from their own countries in this conflict, because this could there's very good chances that this conflict can really escalate, that Britain, the United States, France, Germany will be sucked in directly into this war. Or if not dying like in airplanes and stuff like that, the economic repercussions, because, they're going to be producing military hardware for this war. And that's going to come at the expense of living conditions in the West. Not to speak of all the other reactionary aftershocks from a war like this. This devastation caused there will spread and spread misery around the world. And it will come back to the West. That's what happened with Iraq. That's what happened with Syria. That's what happened with Libya. It's exactly the same thing. It's a continuation of these so-called forever wars. And it's really going to be a disaster. But for the workers of the global South, this is really a question of self-preservation. If the US and Israel can get away with this, then this will weaken and open up the possibilities of their own countries being attacked in this kind of way. And so they really need to fight against their own, the regimes of the global South who really conciliate the United States and Israel.
And what about people in Iran right now, the working class of Iran right now? Because obviously the Iranian regime is no friend of the masses. There was huge demonstrations against the regime of the Ayatollahs like 2 years ago with the brutal murder of Masha Amini. There is I would assume, I'm not that familiar, I would assume a healthy degree of opposition to the regime. But as you said, right, we need to have a clear side, right? Iran is being gone after, and you need to have a side. Otherwise, implications will be devastating. So what would our message be to workers in Iran?
Yeah, I think that's really the key argument for all those who argue against standing with Iran in this war, is pointing to the reactionary character of the government. And that there's no denying that, the forced the imposition of the veil, all kinds of very reactionary measures taken by the government. It's extremely brutal and so on. But the point here is that if Israel gets its way, this is going to bring down the whole region. It's going to bring down all of Iran. It's not going to be a step forward for women, for any of the oppressed minorities or anything like that. They need to fight for the defeat of Israel, while at the same time trying to build an opposition that's a working class opposition to the regime. But you'll never be able to build such an opposition if you just equate Israel and Iran in this war. Workers in Iran this is such a case of aggression that you'll never get the working class of Iran to be like, oh, well, plague on both your houses. They're going to want to defend their nation, their country against Israel. And so what you have to show is how the regime of the mullahs is really an obstacle to the defense of Iran and to, more broadly, kicking out the imperialists of the region.
I guess to throw a little bit of orthodoxy in there, are you referring to the anti-imperialist network?
Yes, but so you need to have a side in this conflict, but that's just one side of the tasks. The other side then is to have a communist strategy in terms of how to wage this war, because the Iranian regime is going to wage this war by the means that it knows, religious and kind of nationalist, whereas what we think is necessary is really a revolutionary proletarian strategy, one that tries to unite the whole region in a war against Israel and against the US, that appeals to the workers in the West, that appeals even to the workers in Israel, and try to exacerbate the contradictions within Israeli society. But also more broadly, that really has as a goal to defeat imperialism and to defeat Zionism. Because if you look at, despite some of their words sometimes, the Iranian regime, if you look at what they've been doing for the last, couple of years, they've been doing everything they can to conciliate and to avoid a confrontation. So that's really why another strategy is needed. And you can't just, what we're not saying is we're not saying cheer on the Iranian regime or anything like that.
But to defend Iran.
Yeah.
And there's two methods of defending it. Yeah. One is of the Ayatollahs and the other one is revolutionary internationalist method.
I think a very easy example is Libya. Of course, Gaddafi was a totally reactionary leader, But if you just look at the disaster, which is Libya today, you can see why it was not in the interest of Libyan workers to, support the destruction of their country or to remain neutral in this.
Yeah. But I guess, again, you can only arrive at this kind of a position if you take a step back and understand the dynamics of this war. If you see the region as a bunch of blocks that you're just moving around and like, oh, well, this country's not at war with this one and that one's not at war with that one. It's really, that's not Marxism. That's like a really academic formalist method, right? You cannot be like, oh, well, Israel, Iran, both capitalist, both reactionary, whatever. I've heard some slogans on the left being like, no war, but class war. And I think that's just,
well, that's that's really a problem. And it's actually quite striking so far in terms of the various declaration or articles that have been written by the left. There's very few that take a clear stand in defense of Iran in this context when it's really urgent. What you'll find is either, plague on both your houses, and I think actually Left Voice reprinted an article of their French organization that is quite explicit, of like, it does not take any kind of stand. And then also just says, basically, you need to fight against all the reactionary forces in the region, imperialism, the regime of the mullahs and Israel, but totally putting them on the same level, which is like, it's not the Ayatollahs that are now invading all these other countries. It's not them that are committing a genocide right now.
The imperialists have a clear side here.
Yes, exactly. And that's what's ironic is that is exactly the arguments that the Zionists have been using in Palestine. They've been pointing to the reactionary character of Hamas as an argument to be neutral or to, in the case of Zionists, to support Israel. So it's exactly this same argument which organizations in the left right now are capitulating to.
Like this particular regime or force is reactionary. So
exactly. But that's why the character of the wars is important.
Right. We've already started to kind of foray into the left and why this, in particular, this position, but we'll get to the others as well. I guess I wanted to just probe a little bit more on trying to win over workers. If I can just ask a couple of questions around that, because obviously, amongst the pro-Palestinian crowd, I'm sure that it's not controversial to say defend Iran, maybe, right? But when we're talking about the working class, say in the West, right, you have workers in the US who, a lot of them voted for Trump. You got right-wing shifts happening in many countries. So out here, we are saying, look, you got to defend Iran, defend Palestine. But the consciousness is elsewhere at the moment. Like, to workers listening, how can we kind of equip them to have some of these discussions in their workplace?
Well, first of all, I'm not so convinced that it's going to be so uncontroversial within the Palestinian movement itself to take a stand with Iran. Because first of all, Palestinian movement that's kind of a bit of an amorphous category. If you look at it, like Zara Sultana in Britain, the Labour Party MP is, and so Rashida Tlaib. So is Corbyn. What line are they going to take on Iran? I think at best you're going to get a pacifist line.
And then the reason is it tarnishes their respectability in these circles of government and whatever, because Iran nukes, it's like, well, you can't really say defend Iran because there goes your career.
Yeah. So I think there's a good chance we'll see more of a polarization within the Palestinian movement itself on this question. There was a protest a few days ago, and it really was not that big compared to some of the protests that have happened in Britain so far. So we'll have to see how that plays out. In terms of the argument to convince workers, I've already touched a bit on it. It's really to point on how the policies of their own governments, of military adventures, of these devastating bombing campaigns and campaigns of military aggression against other countries, how this not only is disastrous for workers abroad, but also directly has repercussions on workers at home, both in terms of like them being drafted in these military conflicts right now and in the future, and also increased repression, restricting democratic rights, and also the economic conditions. If the Western countries have to more and more gear towards war, that means less money for wages, less money for social services, and so on and so on. So it's to really kind of make this link that the forever wars abroad come at the direct expense of workers at home.
Okay, so let's then dive into the left. Now, obviously, these organizations, they are a reflection of social pressures that exist in the world. So yeah, we're going to talk about the left, but really these are kind of illusions that exist amongst people in general. We've already touched on why, to not have a side with Iran is really a gross capitulation. That's a capitulation to US imperialism. So if you say, oh, well, plague on both your houses, guess what you're doing? You're inadvertently helping Israel and US imperialism achieve their aims of crushing Iran.
Yeah.
So, you know what? Not revolutionary.
It's very concrete, like workers in Iran, what should they do? Should they stop producing air defense missiles? Should they stop producing weaponry? And no, that would be suicidal. You have a regime there in Israel intent on destroying your country and turning your country into Libya, basically.
Right.
And you should tell those workers, no, don't do anything, just, overthrow your own regime. Of course, we want workers to overthrow the regime of the Ayatollahs, but it matters how. Will it be overthrown through an imperialist back intervention, or will it come from pushing forward the struggle against imperialism and workers understanding that this regime is a total obstacle to the advance of their own interests? So I think that's a way to kind of look at the consequences. Whereas in the West, what should workers do? They should stop weapon shipments to Israel and to the US, and same thing with Israel. Like the bombs that the Israeli workers are producing are directly undermining the position of Israeli workers at home, because they're giving the ability to their ruling class to devastate the region, which is not good for them either.
Exactly. I think one of the points that we make regarding the Zionist state is that so long as the Zionist entity exists, Israeli Jewish workers will never actually be safe. Yeah. And this is you see this playing out right now. So really, it's in the interest of Israeli workers to join hands with the working classes of other countries in the region and, one, first and foremost, fight for an end to Israel's war of aggression, and two, champion Palestine, because that's what's getting lost in this. There's so much hysteria about like, oh my God, we don't want to capitulate to this bad regime or that bad regime. But in the meantime, unless you understand that this is an extension of the genocide of Palestinians, then what you're also doing is, for all your solidarity and revolutionary rah-rah over Palestine, if you don't have a side with Iran, you're also betraying the cause of Palestinian liberation. I think that's maybe what's not dawned on the left in this kind of formalistic approach.
Yeah, and we have no illusions of how difficult it's going to be to break Israeli workers from Zionism. That's a very, very strong commitment. But they are also in this war directly seeing the impacts on their lives in a much more direct way of what the consequences of Israel's policies are. Yeah. And that is going to, not in the short term, but in the more medium term, exacerbate tensions within Israel. And it's really crucial to try to have a Marxist intervention within Israel to polarize society on class lines and to really make the basic Marxist point. No nation can be free while it oppresses another one.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So carrying on with the theme of discussing the different trends in the left. So it's been 4 days. Organizations have more or less put out what they have to say about this huge escalation in the Middle East, but not all of it's good. In fact, very little of it, from my understanding, is good. So take us through some of the other trends that exist on top of kind of just, stupidly equating Iran and Israel.
Yeah. So, some do it kind of explicitly, as I've already said, Le Voice's article, but others, it's more kind of pacifist. So you have an article by the CWI, Committee for Workers International. So they can say, this is a war of aggression from Israel. And actually, a lot of people say it. Actually, even a lot of the bourgeois, media kind of, it's kind of obvious. So that's not Marxist per se. It's just kind of the, it's reality in front of everybody's eyes. So that's not a great accomplishment. But then what's the conclusion they draw? It's like no to the war. Well, what does that mean? No to the war. It's like going back to the example I've already given, like workers in Israel and Iran in the context of this war have different tasks. Workers in Iran, they obviously didn't want this war, but it's imposed on them, and they should not just down their weapons and let themselves get massacred by the Israelis. They need to defend themselves.
Right.
But that's hidden in these. Of course, everybody wants to stop war. But if you want to stop war in the Middle East, you need to defeat Israel. And more fundamentally, you have to push back the imperialists out of the region. They're the ones that have really provoked and fueled all these conflicts that have, torn this region apart over decades and decades.
Okay, I think that's fair enough. But I wanted to ask you to flesh that out a little bit, because, ordinary people might be like, well, yeah, this is bad. We don't want war, right? So how do you try and really intersect where they're at? Because, okay, fine. It's one thing if a left group, so-called socialist group says no to war and they're just a pacifist capitulation to imperialism. But then, how workers or how ordinary people approach it is different, of course, right? So how do you intersect where they're at?
Yeah, well, again, I think the best is to look at it concretely. No to war between Israel and Iran. Like,
Right.
stop this war.
Mhm.
That's kind of, a lot of the regional powers and, that's kind of their position. They would just like, to go back before the 13th of June. That's what Russia wants, that basically Saudi Arabia. And a lot of the Western powers are kind of saying, de-escalate, peace, blah, blah, blah. And that can sound like, okay, yes, that, superficially, that would be less people dying. But what would that concretely mean? It would mean a return to the genocide in Gaza. So it's not like
So you have no war, but you still have an ongoing genocide and nothing's resolved.
Exactly. What needs to be done is Israel needs to be defeated. That's what really needs to be done. And as I said already, like, the imperialists need to be defeated. That's how you're going to get any kind of basis to actually develop and rebuild that region and have actually the possibility of peace and coexistence between the various peoples.
I think the way you're laying this out, it really just reinforces for me anyways, the point that to really stand aside and not have a side in this, there are really reactionary implications of that, because now here's a situation developing, and as revolutionaries, we need to fight as much as possible to actually win the working class over to this defense of Iran, but also to fight for a strategy that can actually advance the defeat of Israel.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's like, well, here we are, no going back to the status quo, and actually push this forward, but in a way that, as you said earlier, builds the unity of the masses in the region on a real solid anti-imperialist basis.
Yeah. And that's really the reason why the region is all divided and run by these very reactionary regimes. It's because of the way the national bourgeoisie reacts to imperialism in a kind of nationalist way, trying to get a better deal with the imperialists.
Yeah.
And so the whole region, you have all these regimes that are totally aligned with the US or play a bit of a middle role. But, all these regimes that are kind of dependent on the United States. And then some that are not, like Iran, that has more of an antagonistic relationship. But again, where does that regime come from? That regime comes from a revolt against the American puppet regime that existed before. And so it's really a product of imperialism that you have all these reactionary governments and monarchies in this region. And the way to both get rid of these regimes and also unite the people in the region is really in a common struggle against imperialism.
The one other slogan I've heard in general whenever the Middle East comes up, but also now, is hands off the Middle East. What's your take on that slogan? Because to me, it strikes me as if it's also part of kind of the pacifist trend.
Yeah, it's kind of similar. I don't know, it could have a bit of a different character. If you're in a in the US and you say hands off, you're kind of opposing the intervention,
right?
But at the same time, I think it does kind of tend towards, again, a pacifist response, which is
just stop this.
Exactly. Let's just stop. I think especially in the current context where this is like such a clear war of aggression on the part of Israel, then to just say hands off is not sufficient.
Okay. Are there other trends on the far left that...
Yeah. Now, I don't have a specific group in mind right now, and it's not necessarily just the far left, but in the Palestinian movement, there's a lot of forces that just openly look to the Iranian regime as like the only kind of hope for the Palestinian people. And so they look at that as the only possibility. And then they go from the correct point that you need to defend Iran against Israel and defend Palestine against Israel, to then draw the conclusion, well, you can't criticize the regime of these countries.
Right. It's under attack.
Exactly. Yeah. Or, how can you in the West criticize the resistance? Those kinds of very kind of moralistic and nationalist basically arguments. But the problem with this is it's really the strategy that the nationalists have is a disaster. If there's a reason why the region is not liberated, it's not just because of the imperialists, but it's also because the various forces that have fought against imperialism have done it in a totally treacherous way, have betrayed struggle after struggle for their own little narrow immediate interests.
What you're alluding to here is we published this leaflet months ago now.
Yeah.
Called "Why Can't Anyone Stop Netanyahu?" Some of those arguments are coming up in this context because, well, as you said, it's been almost 2 years. There's the axis of resistance, there was Hezbollah, the Houthis, and so on. And all these forces, they've not been able to stop this genocide. And I guess those are some of the arguments that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So I'd really encourage listeners to, I'll link this in the show notes, but it's called Why Can't Anyone Stop Netanyahu? And it does take up the nationalist regimes and their fundamentally conciliatory character.
But who chose the moment for this war now? It's Israel. Well, we'll see how it evolves, but basically, at least they have the initiative. They're the ones kind of dictating the rhythm of events for the last, since October 7th, and whereas the different forces in the region, the resistance, they're always reacting on the back foot. And it would have been much better if the conflict with Iran was happening while Israel hadn't really resolved the conflict with Hezbollah. That would put Iran and Lebanon in a much better position. But, Israel basically dealt with, or at least kind of somehow pacified the Hezbollah front, and now is trying to open a new front. Now, we'll see how that goes for Israel. There's no guarantee that this is going to be successful. But they had at least the chance to choose their moment. And that's because the Iranian regime, since the very beginning, has been doing everything to negotiate and to try to kind of find some kind of deal, which really is at the expense of the Palestinians. Any deal in this context is at the expense of the Palestinians.
Yeah. The point I want to make in response to what you just said is the necessity of making the distinction between the regime and its strategy and defense of the given country at hand, right? Because I think that's the trap that some leftists fall into. Well, Iran is reactionary, conflating the country with how it's governed and who governs it, right? It's like, well, no, obviously throughout our discussion, we've actually tried to make the point repeatedly that, well, the Ayatollahs, their strategy has been undermining the defense of Palestinians. They've not been able to stop Netanyahu. And the way they're going to wage this war, right? Look, we stand side by side with them, but the way they're going to wage this war is ultimately not the way to defeat Israel. So we take a side with Iran, with the working masses, but we have our own different strategy, which relies on the strength of the working masses in the entire region to build a unity. So I think if you can't make that distinction, then you really are going to be stuck in a hopeless mess of capitulation, because guess what? That's what the imperialists do. They're like, Iran, reactionary, crazy. And, that's just a non-starter.
It's just, if I can make just a bit of a more general point, it's always how debates are presented. It's you're with A or you're with B. Right. And that's it. You have no other choice. But Marxist view of the world can deal with much more contradictory situations. So yeah, both regimes are reactionary. That is true in a very general sense. Right. But concretely speaking, there's a war where one is waging a war of aggression and the other one is waging a just defensive war. And so the struggles against both these regimes in that context will be played out in a different way. The struggle against the reactionary regime in Israel will have as a dynamic force opposing the war of aggression, and the dynamic of the struggle against the regime in Iran will be played through its conciliation and terrible strategy to actually defend the country against imperialism.
But you're just capitulating to the national bourgeoisie.
Right, exactly. That will be the attack.
Well, the Spartans have become nationalists.
Right.
And I'm saying this as a joke, but I hope that some of the way that we've tried to lay this out can help crack open some of those contradictions or confusions that that's just not the case. Okay, what else have we got left here to do? Well, maybe let me ask you. You touched on the respectable kind of labor right leaders here, the liberals in the West, and how we'll see. As you mentioned, there was a demonstration here in London. I believe it was an emergency demonstration in opposition to Israel's escalation, but it was miserable. The turnout was really, really pathetic. Which to me, it shocked me, because I thought you'd have hundreds of thousands in the streets again because how big the Palestine movement has been here. However, I think upon discussing and so on, it made sense that, well, how are these labor right leaders going to then come out and be like, oh yeah, please defend Iran, right? I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how this is playing out in the US, if you know, or...
There's just, I think, an additional point is I think it's not so clear to people yet that this escalation in the Middle East will have direct repercussions elsewhere. I do not think it's clear to people that Britain will probably be dragged into this war, that the US will probably be dragged into this war. I'm not sure that has kind of sunk in yet. So I think that partly explains as well the lack of mobilization so far. And I think the other thing you talked about, which is really the very conciliatory and capitulatory nature of the leaders of some of these movements. I hope that, as the war goes on, that the revolutionary forces will readjust and clarify and their lines and to actually take a clear stand. But the early signs are not very encouraging.
No, they're not. And we've recently done an episode on the crisis in the Marxist left and the overall kind of disarray and the weakness of the forces when, so to speak, shit's hitting the fan. Then this is only going to further that weakness and really going to give the right-wing march the upper hand. And all of this spells bad news for workers everywhere. So yeah, there is a real need to clarify like what's the right approach to this war and why actually it's absolutely necessary to take a stand in defense of Iran in order to fight against imperialism, but also to fight for Palestinian liberation. That remains at the heart of this entire conflict.
On the US, on your question about the US, I don't really know so much about what's going on right now. The only thing I saw is this pretty lame article by the PSL, which
Party for Socialism and Liberation.
Yeah. Which is, I think it's not even very clear on the stand itself it takes on the war, but it's all about like the UN and how it's illegal according to the rules of the UN Charter, blah blah blah. And a lot of people are still really, I'm struck, like they're still really stuck in this, like illusions that that international law means something. That it's not just the strongest who impose their will.
Well, I mean, look, they did arrest Duterte.
Right, of course,
Sorry, that's a joke if that wasn't clear. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You want to talk about crimes against humanity. This is the most glaring example in this century so far. So what the hell? Where is the international community? Yeah, but I think, that what people overlook is who calls the shots in this international community.
The point is just, it's to have any kind of illusions that the UN, any of these international institutions, or any of these other powers are going to somehow stop what's going on is a total illusion.
Well, speaking of this, what about Russia and China? Actually, we haven't talked about these other powers. What is their stance on this? Because, Iran is all up in the BRICS situation. What's going on there?
Well, in a sense, they're not so different from the left. I mentioned it before. They want to go back to before June 13th.
Stop the war.
Stop the war. Okay. That's basically their...
Could be marching in the same stop the war.
Exactly. That's basically their approach. But they're not supporting the Palestinian resistance. And I don't know if they're, I know that Russia gave some air defense to Iran, but clearly they didn't give enough,
I think I've seen that they have denounced Israel's aggression, which, but it remains to be seen.
But in terms of being in favor of arms being transferred, this is a clear case where actually in this war, giving arms to Iran would actually be a good thing. It would actually allow the country to resist its destruction by the Zionists.
I think the other thing is it's not so clear for me how this is going to develop. How long is this going to last? What's the end game? I think those are all things that remain to be seen. The headlines I've seen today so far, I've just glanced at the FT. It doesn't sound good for Iran.
It's very hard to tell. Everybody's lying. I think it's very probable that the strikes that Israel is doing on Iran are more destructive than the strikes Iran is doing on Israel. Like, that doesn't determine the outcome of the war because Iran is a much bigger country.
That's true.
So depends also how long this lasts. If Iran can kind of resist the onslaught or not. So I think it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. Most of the left have written very descriptive articles about what's happening, which largely just repeats what's already all in the news. Right. But that's not really what's really the task. What's really the task right now is to have a correct approach, correct position on the conflict. That's the starting point. And then we'll see, I think, and adjust as the conflict evolves.
Absolutely. Okay, well, on that note, workers, if you're listening, take a stand with Iran and Palestine. And I'm sure we'll be following up on this as the situation evolves. Thank you very much for being with us to explain all of this. I will link the relevant articles, including our leaflet that we published just a few days ago on the war, in the show notes. Do follow us on X at SpartacistICL. Any other remarks?
Thanks for the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you. We'll see you guys soon. Bye.